Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Dark Souls, specifically Prepare to Die Edition. It's the PC version that was released a year after the original release on PS3 and Xbox 360, which was 2011. And you can, of course, get Prepare to Die Edition on console as well. But it's basically just the base game with some slight tweaks here and there, and it includes the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. Now, it was developed by From Software and published by Namco Bandai, and it's basically a successor to Demon's Souls. Now, I have not played Demon's Souls because I don't have a PlayStation 3, and I don't really plan on getting one, so chances are I'm probably never going to play Demon's Souls, and ultimately, I'm just going to judge Dark Souls based on its own merits and detriments. Now, this video is coming to you courtesy of Tasca. He sent me this quite a while ago, and I've just never really gotten around to actually delving through it. So while I do greatly appreciate him sending me the game to take a look at, ultimately, there was a distinct difference between what I was hoping for, which I actually was looking forward to Dark Souls, believe it or not. I know people have this ridiculously idiotic notion that I go into every single game wanting to hate it, but I actually went into this game really wanting to enjoy it because it seemed like it would be something that was pretty much right up my alley. But ultimately, the progress I made was just really slow. I mean, over time, I've put about 14 hours into the game. I managed to get up to the giant rat in the sewers. I, of course, defeated the Capra Demon, as you saw in that video if you've seen that clip I put up. There's also that video I put up on how incredibly terrible the PC port for Prepare to Die Edition is. Now, I don't really feel like reiterating that, but basically you have to mod the game in order for it to be even remotely acceptable as a PC game, and even then it's still not acceptable. You still require a gamepad, because if you try to play this on keyboard and mouse, it is terrible. In fact, it was to the point where I didn't even start to play this thing seriously until I did manage to get a gamepad, so by the time I got one, I'd had it for quite a long time, and I didn't really have much motivation to play it back then, so it ended up taking me even longer to actually start my playthrough in earnest, and I can't finish the game. Before I started making this video, the only motivation I had still to actually play Dark Souls was simply so I could actually get a video done on it. The game was ultimately just so incredibly boring to me that I became completely apathetic toward it. Now, those of you who are watching me play through this live know that I was getting rather frustrated at numerous points in the game, particularly on the Bell Gargoyles bit, and that's because of a few key problems that I'll explain more when I get to the actual gameplay portion of this video. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about the presentation. One thing that this game does extremely well is the overall art design. They have done a fantastic job of making this look like a dark fantasy game. And despite the studio being Japanese, they did it in a decidedly Western style, so it's something that is readily accessible to a Western audience. Now, that does mean that everything is rather brown and gray and realistic. Well, as realistic as a fantasy game like this is going to get, I suppose. But the point is that they put in this very drab, very bland color scheme that's mostly brown and gray and not much else, and that's rather tiring after a while. Now, obviously, this is very much intentional. They intended the world to look rather dreary and depressing, but eventually the ambiance wears off and it just becomes drab and dreary, and you just sit there going, well, they couldn't spice up the visuals much other than this? Okay, whatever. And that's a real shame too, because despite the color scheme wearing out its welcome, the actual artistry here is pretty damn good. There's quite a bit of attention to detail, and the environments themselves are laid out in a way that mostly makes sense. And similarly, they've done a great job with the character and enemy designs, where everything has its own distinct look that definitely screams, "This is Dark Souls," and it's usually shown in a decent amount of detail considering this was primarily made as an Xbox 360 game. In fact, the PC version is a direct port of the Xbox 360 version, which means that it inherited its extremely low-res textures and low-res rendering, and that is a problem because it means that everything is rather blurry vanilla. Now, in the footage you're seeing, I'm actually rendering the game at 1080p because I'm using DSFix, which is mandatory for the PC version. If you don't run DSFix and you're running Dark Souls on PC, then there's something wrong with you. But anyway, this means that the visuals are actually upgraded from what you would normally see if you were running this in the standard resolution, which is 1280 by 720, and it's actually upscaled from, I believe, 480p in the actual rendering, which means that it looks terrible at that resolution. DSFix allows you to actually render at the resolution you want it to render at, which means that the game doesn't look like complete trash. Now, of course, that doesn't stop the game from running at 30 frames a second because it's locked at 30 frames a second, and if you try to uncap the frame rate, it can actually get you VAC banned, I believe. But it is still an essential improvement for anyone trying to play Dark Souls Prepare to Die Edition. Now, the thing that you will have to put up with are the rather sluggish and kind of clunky animations where you'll have a ridiculous amount of wind-up to just swing a sword or something like that. And when you're using two-handed weapons in particular, it's like they weigh 80 pounds when in reality they would have weighed maybe 6 or 7. Now obviously they did that for game balancing reasons rather than realism's sake, but it does mean that the actual combat animations make you look like an amateur at best. Now I'm sure that's intentional, but it does bring up a point that I will readdress when I get to the gameplay segment, which is the sluggish animations. Apart from that, you will also notice that there is no lip syncing at all. The characters just sit there and don't actually open their mouths. It's kind of odd, actually. But other than that, the texture quality is fairly low, but that's to be expected from an Xbox 360 game ported to PC, and the modeling is generally of pretty good quality, so they at least got that going for them. The sound design is a bit messier. They have sound effects that work but aren't particularly great, and voice acting that would be described as amateur at best. It's certainly not the worst I've ever seen, but it's not very good either. And then you get to the music, which is kind of non-existent for the majority of the game. And then you get to a boss fight, and all of a sudden it is blaring this massive orchestral suite, and you're like, wait, what? That's sudden. I mean, don't get me wrong, the music is fairly good actually, but the problem is that you go directly from silence to massive sweeping orchestral epic. And there's nothing in between to have a transition, so it ends up being rather jarring. But once you get past all that, you get into the story and the gameplay, and that's where things are supposed to get interesting, but ultimately they just become incredibly boring. I would describe the plot in this game as practically non-existent. After a single cutscene that is supposed to give you the backstory of the world, even though it doesn't really do a particularly great job of it, you find yourself in a cell in the undead asylum. You are undead. This means that you were thrown into the asylum because reasons? And this knight comes along and tosses a key down to you so you can escape from your cell, and when you meet up with him later, he tells you to go ring the 2 bells of awakening. You're not told why, you're not told what they'll do, you're just told, hey, go ring these bells. And this highlights one of the 2 biggest problems that the game has. It's not so much that the plot is extremely minimalistic, that's not that big of a deal. The problem is that the game does an absolutely terrible job of explaining itself to the player. Oh, it gives you the basic controls, but anything beyond that, and you're just SOL. You have to figure all that out on your own. Now, some of that you can do on your own. You can learn the timings down for different attacks, you can learn that certain weapons have different attributes compared to others, but unless you're consulting a wiki or a guide of some sort, you're going to have absolutely no idea what you're doing throughout the entire game. Did you know that certain enemies are practically invulnerable except to certain types of damage? No? Well, too bad, because the only way you're going to find that out, other than simply running into them and noticing that your weapons are doing jack shit to them, is if you consulted a wiki beforehand and found out, oh hey, there's these monsters that are only vulnerable to holy damage or something like that. Well, gee, maybe I should go find a holy weapon. Oh wait, where are those? I don't know, maybe I should consult a guide. But here's the thing, you shouldn't have to consult a guide to be able to understand the basic gameplay elements. A wiki or a guide is supposed to be there to optimize your playing experience, to give you access to things you wouldn't necessarily have been able to access if you had just gone through the game normally, or to optimize your character build so you have the most powerful character you can have with what you're trying to go for. It's not supposed to be something that you have to consult because the game didn't tell you what you need to know. And that goes for both gameplay mechanics and the lore, because the lore is barely even in the game at all. If you didn't consult a wiki or a guide, then you wouldn't be able to keep track of the vast majority of the lore in this game because it's all relegated to readables that are all tucked out of the way, so you actually have to go looking for them specifically to actually get anything resembling lore. And you know what the really funny part about Dark Souls being deliberately obtuse is? When Final Fantasy XIII did the exact same thing and relegated all of the relevant information that you needed to have an inkling of what the hell is going on in that game to the readables that are tucked away in several menus, people rightly lambasted it because you're sitting there going, what the hell is going on? But when Dark Souls does it, resulting in a very similar level of what the hell is going on, somehow people seem to think it's the best thing in the universe. I legitimately cannot understand that level of hypocrisy. And that raises one of the biggest positives and simultaneous negatives of this game: the fan community. On the one hand, the fan community is extremely dedicated, and if you are trying to learn how to play Dark Souls, they generally will help you out quite a bit. But it seems like for every one of those extremely helpful, very positive influences on the Dark Souls community, there's a counterpart who is constantly spouting the get good bullshit and generally being incredibly toxic. Acting like if you don't like Dark Souls, then obviously there's something wrong with you. You're a filthy casual and you should stick to Call of Duty and nothing else. Well, I've got a news flash for you. The reason that Dark Souls is perceived as so difficult is because the vast majority of people playing it are casual gamers. You need to understand that it's not a problem of whether the game is a cakewalk or not. It's why there is perceived difficulty. And this generally falls into one of a few categories. The first is control problems. There is input delay. There is an amount of time between when you press a button and when it actually does what you tell it to do. Now, I'm not sure of the exact amount of time, but from my very, very rough calculations based on what I was experiencing in the game, I'd estimate it to be somewhere between a second and a half of delay. And there's no way to cancel the actions like if you were playing, say, Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, where you can hit the attack button and then an enemy will strike at you, but you can immediately hit the counter button, and regardless of where you were in that swing, you will instantly counter. That doesn't happen in Dark Souls. When the game parses your controller input, you are committing fully to whatever it is you were trying to do. And sometimes it doesn't commit to what you were trying to do, instead doing what you don't want it to do, because the controls really aren't very good in Dark Souls. For example, the jumping controls in this game are just flat out terrible. You have to be sprinting to be able to jump, otherwise you're just gonna roll. And sometimes, even when you are sprinting, the game decides you're gonna try to roll anyway. And if you were trying to jump across a chasm, then that's a particularly big problem, because now instead of jumping, you're gonna roll off of the chasm and instantly die. So ultimately, the controls can be described as clunky. They work, certainly, and they're not the worst I've ever seen, but the input delay and the fact that you have 3 actions bound to the same button means that they can get kind of awkward at times. And once you get used to the actual controls themselves, you start getting used to the combat mechanics, and that's where things start to become a lot murkier. Now, the basic controls are that you get a light and a heavy attack, and you can wield your weapon with 1 or 2 hands. If you wield it with 1 hand, you can have a shield in the offhand, and you can use that to parry attacks or just outright block them. The green bar you see is your stamina meter, and the red bar is your health. Your stamina goes down whenever you swing your weapon, or whenever you block an attack, or whenever you sprint, jump, or roll. Lowering your shield allows you to regenerate your stamina fairly quickly, so it becomes a matter of balancing attack and defense and making sure that you're never running out of stamina. You also get items that you can use in combat using the D-pad to activate them, and those can be things like Estus flasks, which will heal you, or you get weapons that you can throw at enemies for additional damage, but are very, very slow to throw. And since you can't interrupt that action, you'd better be well aware of when you're trying to throw something and not leave yourself wide open to getting smacked in the face. Because the first thing you notice about this game is that you really don't want to get hit. When you get hit, you take a lot of damage. Even from the weakest enemies in the game, you will take a fair amount of damage. And if you're going up against a boss, then generally speaking, they can take you out in 1 to 2 hits. So your primary method of avoiding damage is to simply not get hit. Dodge as much as you possibly can. Dodging does have iframes in it, invincibility frames, where during certain parts of the animation for when you're dodging, you are invulnerable to being hit. The thing is, that would be okay except for the fact that the hitboxes in this game are borked. And this is something that would persist at least as far as Dark Souls 2. I don't know about Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne, but it's very least in Dark Souls 2, I know, where the hitboxes are just wildly inconsistent. Sometimes an enemy will swing a weapon at you and you will get hit despite the weapon clearly missing you. If you think I'm lying or making that up in some fashion, then I have bad news for you, because I actually have a clip of that directly from one of the live streams I did of Dark Souls, where I was trying to fight Pavel and he managed to hit me without his weapon actually hitting me. I even slow the clip down and zoom in so you can get a better view of what's going on. The weapon did not hit, yet I still took the damage and died from it. When you die in Dark Souls, and you will, it will be because of things like that, the less tangible things that aren't really related to your own lack of skill. You'll die because you'll run into an enemy you've never encountered, so you have no idea what their actual attack patterns are, and they're hidden in a corner, so they come at you from the side, and you're like, wait, what just happened? You'll die because in the middle of a boss fight, all of a sudden there'll be another boss monster that flies in to hit you with an unblockable flame breath attack while you're trying to take down the other guy. That's the Bell Gargoyle fight, in case you didn't know. Or you'll just die because the game has a really nasty habit of blindsiding you with enemies that don't necessarily look all that powerful, but then one-shot you. Unless you're completely incompetent, the vast majority of your deaths in this game are not going to be your own damn fault. If it were actually a matter of skill, then I wouldn't have a problem with it, but it's actually a matter of patience. It's a matter of putting up with a clumsy, sluggish combat system and putting up with the sheer amount of cheese that the game throws your way, only to get really not much reward in the end. You don't feel satisfied once you've beaten a boss, you just go, oh, well, I figured out how to cheese it to death. People like to throw around the word skill with regards to Dark Souls all the time, but it's really not much of a thing. There's a bit of it associated with figuring out the timings for things, but that's just about any melee combat system in any game. The only real difference here is that Dark Souls is a lot less forgiving than those other games. Instead of basically being able to make multiple mistakes, it's like, oh, well, you're just instantly dead because this guy one-shot you. But here's a problem. There's a difference between being frustrated to the point where you actually want to do better at the game, and being frustrated because it just keeps getting in your way. The punishment for dying in Dark Souls is that you respawn at the previous bonfire with no souls left, and souls being the general currency / experience in this game. And that just means that, oh great, now I have to grind a bit more to get back to where I was and maybe go and find where I died and pick up the lost souls. It's a mild annoyance that gets increasingly annoying the further you get into the game, especially because the further you get into the game, the more you realize that the difficulty is based entirely around cheese and not around your lack of skill. And ultimately that's the problem that kills it. It's not just the fact that the game is so deliberately obtuse that it gives you basically nothing to go on in terms of plot or even a reason for doing what you're doing. Although that's certainly a part of it when it comes to the actual gameplay mechanics also being obtuse, so there's that. But it's really the fact that the difficulty in the game is really more because the game mechanics themselves just really aren't very good. If the movement and combat didn't feel like you were trying to wade through molasses and the controls were tight and responsive, it would be a different story. Then it would be easier to overlook the fact that every single time you die, you're not so much questioning what did I do wrong as how did this game screw me over. But as it stands, and I know all you Dark Souls fans are probably going to be bitching at me in the comments right now about this, Dark Souls just isn't a very good game. It's fairly mediocre at best. It not simply being press X to win is not enough to absolve it of its sins. The thing is that really all of the major problems with Dark Souls can be fixed. Now, of course, the thing is, I don't know if they've been fixed because I haven't played Dark Souls 2 or 3, nor have I played Bloodborne, so I don't know if they improved it later on in the series or not. It's possible, but I don't know for certain. That's why I'm not writing Dark Souls 2 and 3 off completely as a result of my experience with the original Dark Souls. The original Dark Souls is a mess. If you enjoy it, whatever, that's fine, but don't go acting like it's some paragon of game design. And it certainly doesn't deserve a free pass for things it does that other games do and get rightly criticized for. But anyway, there you go, folks. My thoughts on Dark Souls. I'm sorry it took me so long to get this video out, and if you were expecting me to just sing the game's praises, then, well, too bad, because I don't really have any praises to sing for it. While it does have atmosphere going for it, and it does have really great art direction going for it, ultimately it's the deliberate obscurity of the gameplay mechanics and the lore, as well as the very, very clunky controls and gameplay mechanics themselves that really do kill the experience. It's a matter of the fun being in spite of the actual game design rather than because of it, and ultimately that means I just can't recommend it. It's not the worst game I've ever played or anything, but for something hyped up this much, for it to be this weak, is downright depressing. Maybe they fix things in the sequels. Like I said before, I haven't written those off completely just because of the original Dark Souls here, because I know they did change some things between Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. So at some point, I guess I'll pick up a copy of those and give them a try and see if there's anything going on with them. If they turn out to be much the same as Dark Souls 1, then I'll just do an MTO on them like I did with Dark Souls 1. If I do manage to actually finish them, then I will do reviews of them. But because of the experience I had with Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2 and 3 are now very low priority, so I'll pick them up when I can, when I feel like it, but don't expect that anytime soon at this point. Thanks for watching.